Okay, thank you very much for being here. I would like to thank the organizer with the ISF for inviting me for this exciting and promising event. I'm truly honored to be here. And I think there could have been no better background for my talk today than what we've heard earlier from my two co-panelists, and also from what we heard from Mr. Bach and Ambassador Che at the ceremony, at the opening ceremony. Mine will be an historical perspective. Namely, I'm taking a case study, Israel's relations with Korea and with Malaysia. I'm contextualizing it within the framework of this forum, trying to make sense to past events, trying to understand what can we learn from them and what meaning do they have. So looking at history and looking at a very interesting case study, I think, which will maybe help us think more about the intention or the aims of this lovely forum. I will open with this slide. An incident that took place at the Rio Olympic Games when Egyptian judoka refused to shake hands with an Israeli judoka. It stirred a lot of interest, a lot of noise in the media. Just take a second to look at this photo. I will get back to it at the end of the talk, and you will understand, maybe, I'm sure you'll understand why I showed it, and I'll get back to it once I finish in the conclusion section. Okay, so why Korea and why Malaysia? Why are they important to Israel in the sense that in the context of sports relations? Of course, this is the historical background. Israel's relations with the Arab world, which have been continuous, unfortunate wars and confrontation. And against this background of war and confrontations, since the 1940s, throughout the 70s, Israel was attempting to establish its position within Asia, the continent which Israel belongs to. It tried to establish relations with different Asian states. Some were successful. Korea was a success in this context, but Israel never established relations with Malaysia. So even though Israel-Korea relations were established, there were tensions. There were periods of tensions when diplomatic relations were not so good. So I would like to look how sport functioned at times when Israel's relations with Korea were not good. And with Malaysia, Israel never established relations. But when I looked at the media of the time and the newspapers, I realized that there were very important sports relations, although the two states never had official relations. So I'd like to look at that and maybe show the importance of sport within international relations. So that is why I chose these two countries, Korea and Malaysia, in the context of my talk today. So just very brief background. Israel's relations with Korea. During the Korean War, Israel moved away from its policy of non-alignment when it joined South Korea in the US. It was a very important decision Israel made at the time. Israel and Korea established relations in 1962. However, during the 1960s and 1970s, the road was very bumpy. Israel's relations with Korea were not always good, especially during the 1970s, when Korea was getting closer to the oil-producing Arab states at the expense of cooling relations with Israel. So in terms of diplomatic relations, they were tense. They were not pretty good during the 70s. However, and I will show it in a minute, sports did play an important role, although diplomatic relations were not at the best level. So what about sport? How did sport play a part in this? Okay, I have an argument or three arguments or three parts of one argument trying to show that sport was important. Even at times when there was no relationships and even at times when relationships were very tense, sport was important to maintain the contacts between Israel and Korea. So first of all, prior to the establishment of relationships, and I remind you that 1962 was the year when Israel and Korea established formal relationships, sport functioned as a significant cultural agent, although diplomatic relations were still not established. How do I know that? I'm reading the papers of that time. Late 1950s, there were official meetings, matches in football and volleyball between teams of the two countries. 1960, Israel's national football team came here to Seoul and played a very big game there. It drew a lot of attention. The president of the time invited the Israeli delegation. The stadium was packed. And according to the news reports of the time, it made a lot of buzz here in Korea. So it was a way of Koreans to learn about Israel, to see the other athletes, and at the same time, for the sports readers in Israel to read about Korea and to read about the experiences of the Israeli athletes in Korea. Former President Park Chung-hee took sports diplomacy seriously, and he advanced sports diplomacy. So it was helpful in this regard in terms of Israel's relations. In October 1961, Israel had a friendly football game, and I'm emphasizing friendly because there are official matches and there are friendly matches. Friendly matches are up to the initiatives of the different agents to organize them. So there was a friendly match, and the head of the delegation, before he left, he said, "We have arrived as friends and we are living as friends," before establishment of official relations. So I find this meaningful. The second part of the argument, what happened after the establishment of formal relations during the 1960s. Again, sport continued to play an important role in the relationships. And how do I know that? Again, reading the newspapers. During the 1960s, there were a series of matches in different kinds of fields, but I found this example the most interesting. In 1964, Korea's football team came to Israel. Israel then hosted the AFC Asian Cup, and it drew huge attention here in Israel. The Korean team came to Israel, played the tournament, but after the tournament ended, instead of going back to Korea, the national team stayed in Israel and played a few friendly matches with Israeli teams, with local Israeli teams at different cities around Israel. Again, the media gave it a lot of exposure here and Korea. So again, we see a very interesting way of sport showing, providing a platform of interest between the two countries. The 1970s were the most problematic because Israel's relations with Korea were deteriorating because of, as I said earlier, Korea's interest in Israel, of course, was not on the top of Korea's economic interest at the time. But even during the 1970s, I see, or I argue, that cultural diplomacy was important, and sports specifically was very important in this regard. There were, in the early 1970s, official handball and football. The most important field of contact was football. Israel and Korea met several times during the 70s. And Israel gave credit to perhaps Korea's most famous footballer in history, Ja Bum-kun, and the newspapers in Israel talked about the Chabum nightmare. What can we do to stop this striker? The whole Israeli defense was saying, okay, this is our biggest problem. And there were many discussions about Cha. Cha is coming, how can we stop him? We are going to Korea, how can we stop Cha? So in this context, Cha Bum-kun and the way he was represented in Israeli and in Israeli press, again, I see it in a way of an agent of introducing, of keeping keeping in line with the relationships between the two countries, because sports readers are reading about Cha, they're reading about Korea, and although diplomatic relations, again, were not very good, football relations were strong. In 1975, again, the problematic 70s, Esther Roth-Shachamorov, at the time Israel's greatest athlete, and perhaps Israel's greatest women athletes ever, she came to Korea. She came to Korea, and she was, according to the newspapers, she was given the royal treatment. She met dignitaries, Korean dignitaries. Very important, it was publicized, the media covered it. So again, even though relationships were not very good, they were cooled down, again, such events were an opportunity to learn, to see, and for people to meet from different fields of different areas. Moving on to Malaysia, and at the end I will bring the whole picture together or summarize. Israel-Malaysia relationships were a bit different because there were a few meetings during the 1950s and 1960s between Israeli officials and Malaysian officials. However, unfortunately, relations were never established. Malaysia had its own interests and its own pressures, and Israel had its own issues, so official relations were never established. However, when I look at sports connections, I see that sports connections were very meaningful until the 1970s. The argument goes like this. Under the Tunku Abdul Rahman, Malaysia's prime minister and the president of the AFC, a very important figure in Malaysian history and Malaysian sports, of course, he took care that football, especially football, remained a very lively channel of relationships between Israel and Malaysia, although there were no diplomatic relations. So football played a very important role here. And it involved the prime minister, senior sports administrations, athletes, and so forth. And I'm mentioning this because, again, I will return to the conclusion, so please remember this important point, how different actors are involved in these relationships. So how did sport play a part in these relationships? First of all, the Merdeka tournament, a very important football tournament organized in Malaysia. Malaysia invited an Israeli sports official to take part in the opening ceremony. Malaysia even extended an invitation to Israel to come and play in the Merdeka tournament, although later Malaysia retracted that invitation. However, although there's something ambiguous in this, I still think that the fact that Malaysia reached out and there was an attempt to make some connection was in itself meaningful. There were several football meetings in 1964, again, Israel hosting the AFC, Asian Cup. Lim Ki-song, an important Malaysian politician and important sports figure, he came to Israel. 2 Malaysian referees came to Israel. Again, a country that has no formal relations with Israel, yet they came, participated, and everything went well in that regard. There were a total of 10 official matches between 1965 and 1974. At the same time, the matches never took place neither in Israel nor in Malaysia. This is an important point because it shows the ambiguity. You will not invite, a Malaysian team will not come to Israel. Malaysia will never invite a national Israeli team to Malaysia. However, the matches took place at different places, and they were an opportunity to read and to know about at least in Israel, about the Malaysian athletes and about Malaysia in general. Outside the field, because when we talk about sports and peace and sports and diplomacy, it's not only what happens in the field, but also in the corridors and in the meeting halls of different organizations. So Malaysia, a very strong player in Asian football, invited Israeli officials. Israeli officials came to Malaysia. Again, no official relations, but Israeli officials came to Malaysia. They sat at the meetings and tried to defend Israel's interests, because Israel was Israel was a source of target of attacks at that time. So while several states were trying to gradually push Israel out of the AFC, out of Asian sports, reports were that usually the Malaysians were sympathetic to Israeli causes, and this gave, a lot of, I think it showed, it gave some positive outviews in Israel towards Malaysia during that time. Israel was finally ejected from the AFC. Between 72 and 79, there were a series of moves to expel Israel out of Asian sports. And the Tunku, he usually objected. He usually refrained from joining the countries who wanted to expel Israel. And when he resigned in 1978, he expressed his discontent from the way politics have become involved in football. He was not only talking about Israel, but also on the Taiwan-China situation. 1967, I'm going back in time, but just to show a meaningful event that happened in 1967, the first time in history when Israeli footballers played in Malaysian soil, on Malaysian soil. Giora Spiegel and Shmulik Rosenthal were two Israeli players who were invited to join the Asia All-Star team. The Asian All-Star team, they played several matches in Malaysia, and they were given permission. They came to Malaysia, and according to the newspapers of that time, they stirred a lot of interests. The fact that they came from Israel, who are these players, and they were greeted very, very nicely when they arrived in Malaysia. So this, again, a way of introducing athletes from different countries, especially when relations are not taking place. Returning to the argument, football, or generally sport, but football was a lively line of communication in terms of Israel-Malaysia relations. Football did not lead to formal relations, of course, as we know. And at the same time, though, in the context of other relationships, low-key level of relationships, football was very powerful. I mean, football was popular both in Israel and Malaysia, so it was a very lively field platform for sharing, for competing, for knowing, for hearing, and for learning from one another. Okay, so if I take the Israeli case, the Israel-Korea case, the Israel-Malaysia case, what can I conclude from these relations, from this historical review? So there are a few things I think we should pay attention to or focus when we talk about what's imperative to ease tension through sports. I'm not talking about peace, although this is a very, a noble idea, but I'm talking about at least easing relations between states. First of all, we need to supply platforms and opportunities. We need agents to provide the opportunities for the different athletes to compete. Without them, there will be no official matches. So I think there are two important agents in this regard. One is the leaders and politicians, and the second, of course, sports officials. Sports officials and political leaders are crucial to provide these platforms. But these platforms are not enough. It's not enough that athletes from different countries compete with each other. We need to take it a step further. And here is what I call reducing the other's otherness. Reducing the other's otherness. I mean, we are looking at people from different countries, from different backgrounds, initially as others. They are different than us, but then gradually we learn to know them better. So there are two important agents, I think, that can play a leading part in reducing the otherness, the way looking at other as maybe even demonizing him, and showing how different he is from us. But there are two agents who are very helpful in bringing or reducing this otherness. One is the athletes themselves, coming to the match, fighting or playing or competing with each other, as we heard earlier from different speakers, the importance of competing. And then we have the media. The media is very important because it's not enough that we have platforms, it's not enough that we have athletes competing, but now it's important for the media to report and to show this to the audience. And I'll show an example in a second. So this leads, I think, can lead to inspiring people-to-people dialogue. People are learning, they're reading the media, they're seeing how competitions are going on, and they're starting to learn about the other and see that the other is not such an awful other. I will show you now a slide, and now remember the slide I showed at the beginning of my talk. This took place last year at a youth karate event in May 2016. An Israeli and an Iranian, two teams, one from Israel, one from Iran, competed against each other. And they competed, and they even stood together at the opening ceremony. And the two coaches from the two teams shook hands, and in this photo that was publicized. Now, just 2 seconds to look at this slide, you can see the respect the two men are showing towards each other. There's no Iran, there's no Israel, there's no politics. They're shaking hands. Look at even the way they're holding hands. It's not like a simple cold shake, but a very warm shake, respecting each other. And of course, this will not lead to peace, but this showing, having the platform, having the athletes respect this platform, and having the media report it is a meaningful way, gradual, meaningful way towards easing tensions. Okay, so a final word. After all, the bottom line is, despite the limitations, sports relations deserve close attention in international relations, and they should be taken seriously. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.